back. In this session, we'll be looking at Dovetail's iPaaS platform. Here we'll explore how the platform works, its use of connectors, and then we'll finish by running through a live demo. So let's start by jumping straight into the platform and run over how it operates. Welcome to Dovetail. Within Dovetail, there are two main areas. The first and most important is the Flow Designer. Now it's here where you'll create your integrations, known commonly within Dovetail as flows. Flows are created by stringing together multiple components, and it's the component that's, when it's configured, aids in the receipt or collection of data. In this example, it's a HTTP call, and then we can transform and route that data, and then we have the ability to then return back or connect to, or both, other platforms. Within Dovetail, you've got multiple components, and they're used as the connectors within a flow. So you can see here that we've got different endpoints. We might want to connect to Amazon. We may want to receive an email, or more formally, we might want to receive something via FTP or SFTP, an API endpoint. Could be something on Samba, even a SOAP request, and can even be data within a SQL database. Now, within the Flow Designer, you've got various different connectors around construction, around routing, where you're splitting data, filtering, as we are on this particular integration flow here. And then you've got things around transformation. So within Dovetail, you've got all of these low-code connectors that you're able to use and quite simply drag and drop into your current flow. And Dovetail supports the transformation of data between EDI and XML, Edifact and XML, Excel to XML, JSON to XML, XML to JSON, CSV. So you've got quite a number here. But something to note is you also have XSLT. And it's here where you can actually provide an XSLT file generated from something like Mapforce, and you can basically drop that into your flow. So what Dovetail does for Mapforce is really brings it together by giving it a formal workflow, and then you can drop your mapping within the flow itself. So it's a really powerful platform, and it leverages the use of other tools like Mapforce in this case in order to deliver a fully functional integration. Now, the second part of the platform is the Flow Manager. And it's here where you're able to see all of your installed flows, all of your running flows, and then you can see the version, how many messages have been successfully completed, how many are pending, how many have failed, and then you've got the last completed and last failed date on there as well. And it's from here that you can start drilling down into the flow and have a look at the transactions and see what has happened to the data at each step. And you're able to quite easily search here and filter for those transactions based on data that has come in from the client or the endpoint in order to query particular messages and see what's happened. Now, there are other areas of the platform that we'll be exploring, but first I'd like to walk you through how messaging works within the Dovetail platform. And then with this understanding, we can then walk through a live example. Dovetail has some great documentation which describes how each component can be utilized and also guidance on how message data flows. What I would like to do is help visualize this so you can get a better understanding before we dive into building a flow. So let's first start with the messages within Dovetail and how they really work and how the mechanism works. When we're talking about messages within Dovetail, what we're really talking about are headers and a body. And what I mean by that is, if we've got a message, which is what we're passing between each of these connectors, then what we have as part of that message are the actual headers and then the body. Now, for this particular integration, we've got an API call. So we've got an API call coming in, and that API will have different header values, and these could be literally actual headers as we'd know them within the API. So we could have an API key. We could even have some specific URL strings. And all of these that coming via that API call would be stored as a header, which forms part of the message. And then within the API, you then have a body. And that body, which is basically the payload of the message, would also then be stored within this message. Now, if this API was a JSON API, then the body in here would contain the JSON object. So the literal string of this would be whatever that is with your payload in there. So it could be, if we're talking about warehouse management, etc., you could have your SKU here, and this could be, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, or description. And then test or whatever. So what we have to understand is from the receiving part, the HTTP input, we're going to receive a message, and that message will contain headers, which will be collections of the actual headers within the API request, and potentially the URL strings, and then the body. Now, in this example, we're then passing that to a filter. We can then filter based on some of the headers or the body. And then we've got various different steps here. As we're doing things like setting headers, the input message, which is this, containing the headers and bodies, will be the same as the message that gets passed in this instance to this next HTTP call that you're doing. However, because it's called set headers, you're actually adding additional kind of user defined headers within this message. So additional headers. And you can remove headers. There's other steps within Dovetail, but it's just to explain that as a message gets received, it's going through whatever your connector, so we call this connector C, we're going to have a message input and we're going to have a message output. Depending on what this connector is doing will depend whether the output is pretty much a copy of the input or whether we're going to manipulate and change that. If this is an API request, it's going out and calling an API, it's going to get a response back, and that message out will be based on the response back from the new API. So at that point, we won't have the original headers and body there. We can do things to maintain that, but conceptually, that's what happens. If this is not doing any kind of transformation or anything like that, then it's going to be passing on, it's going to be filtering, etc. there. If we were to do some kind of Mapforce mapping, so if we had XSLT file there, then obviously the input message here and the output message would be different because we're transforming data. We could be mapping one field over here, one field over there, one field here, etc. In essence, the data will be output based on the input that you provide. And again, this same, if this was XML to JSON, then the message here would be the output would be pushed here into what is known as the body. And then there might be potential headers, although for a mapping, it's likely that the headers would be blank. But any headers would be here. And then we can further add headers to this further down the mapping if we wanted to add some enrichment, etc. to that as well. So now you understand how messages work within Dovetail, the fact that we've got a message object, which basically contains headers, and a body. We can now look at the scenario that we're going to look at around taking data from a calling API and sending it onwards to another API. So let's look at the scenario now. With our scenario, we're going to be looking at an SAP IDOC, which is going to come in via an API, and we're going to move that into Snapfulfil WMS as an API call. The data we'll receive will be an IDOC Mapforce file, which will basically simulate a material master data from SAP. And then this is going to move then into Snapfulfil. And in Snapfulfil, we're going to create from this a product. And also we're going to do a second call to the product alternative endpoint in order to create the EAN reference there. So the message will be translated from an IDOC XML into a JSON call to two endpoints as per Snap's API documentation. So we'll create a product and then an alternate. Now we'll be very briefly looking at the Snap WMS API documentation just so you can understand what we're dealing with in creating that endpoint. But before I do that, I just want to explain that in order to test this particular simulation, I've actually created two endpoints in Dovetail in order to simulate or basically mock the responses we might get back to Snapfulfil. So we are going to be simulating calling Snapfulfil's product endpoint, an alternate endpoint, but what we're actually going to do in this scenario is create the same data model, but call an endpoint, a very simple mocked endpoint in Dovetail, so that we can manipulate that and get responses that test our endpoint. So I can show you how it works in both happy path and potentially unhappy path. So now we've covered the scenario and the kind of data that we're going to be manipulating and how we're going to be receiving an input from an API and then calling a forward API as well. Let's take a quick look at the Snapfulfil API documentation so we can see what a product call will look like and what an alternative call will look like. Welcome to the Snap Web API help page. What we're going to do here is going to move down to the API endpoints we're going to be working with. So firstly, we're going to be working with the products API. And here we're going to be doing a post. So we're going to create a product. So if I click on here, we can then see the various different attributes we can provide as part of that API. And there'll be some minimums that we're going to need to supply as part of that. Things like the biz ID, which is the kind of owner of that product, or at least the owner of the product from a description perspective. You could actually create a product, and within Snapfulfil, you can have different owners of that product. When you receive it, you can have owner A of one product and owner B of another. So you might have two different customers, both storing Kellogg's Rice Krispies, for instance. But at the end of the day, the product itself will be identified by the EAN for that particular product, but it's being owned by two different owners. That's just to clear that up so you can understand. So descriptions and things like that will be mandatory, as well as item height, width, weight, etc. But a lot of this information, although can be supplied, will be dependent on the business requirements for that particular customer. A lot of this we won't be providing as part of our example, because really all we need is the SKU, the biz ID, description, and then a little bit around the dimensions of that item. And that would create our product. However, our product may be known as Kellogg's Rice Krispies, for instance. We then would have potentially multiple barcodes on that product, or we could have multiple barcodes on that product in order to identify it. So once we successfully create the product by doing a post to the API endpoint for products, we then need to create the product alternate. And we would do that again using a post. And within the post, we have to provide the original SKU ID, which would be, in this instance, the Kellogg's Rice Krispies, for instance. We would then provide the type. So here we might call this an EAN. And then we would then need to provide the alternate SKU ID. So this would be the EAN reference itself. So we've got different alternates we can create for different products. And it could be that you're ordering a product from China. So it's got, I don't know, a Chinese style EAN barcode on it, a European barcode on it, an American, whatever that is. And you can add all three of those in by creating multiple product alternates so that you've got multiple points of reference to identify that product. The only thing you have to do in any warehouse is ensure that that particular identifier is unique to only that product. But again, we're going into more sort of WMS processes and that sort. But we can see here quite simply, we've got a very small amount of data that we need to post to the product alternates endpoint in order to basically create the alternate against the SKU that we've just created by then calling the product endpoint. So now we've gone over the documentation. Let's jump straight into Dovetail and we're going to start building this particular integration. In order to create our integration, we first need to create a new group. So we're going to create a group and we're going to call this SAP to WMS. Hit create. We can then from here, we can create or at least add a new flow. So we're going to hit add. We're going to select our flow group, which is our SAP to WMS. And then we can call this one product flow and hit create. This has then created us a new flow where we can start building and adding components. So we said at the start that we're going to have an inbound HTTP because this is an API. So we can drag that on the canvas and drop it there. Now straight away, this is giving us an endpoint. And we can see down here what the test endpoint is. It's given us the URL here. And there's also a production URL for when we deploy this to production. From here, what we firstly want to do is we want to validate the API key that would be passed as a header into this request. So we're expecting an API request, and we are actually going to set up a content router in order to determine whether the API key that's been provided is valid or not. Before we go any further and start configuring our content router, we're going to go into settings and we're going to add a flow property. And this flow property is going to be flow key. And that key we can then set for the testing environment. And we can also set a key for the production environment. Now I won't keep that one the same. So this one we could just go X, Y, Z, X. There we go, just to make them different. We can then also, I like to add the tracing on here at this point. So we can hit that. Hit save just so we've got that saved and we've got our flow keys set up. Now from here what we need to do is we need to hit configure and we need to set up our rules for our router. So the rule name on here is going to be valid API key. And the expression type for this is going to be simple because what we're simply checking is that the header, which is going to be called API key, is equal to our flow property setting, which is our flow key. So we can hit validate expressions, they're valid. Now we've got this, we can look at both our routes, which would be happy path, which is valid API key, and unhappy path. Let's start with the unhappy path. What we'd want to do is return back to the user a 401, basically unauthorized, because they haven't provided the valid API key. In order to do that, what we probably want to do first of all is we want to remove any of the current headers. So we're going to plop this on here, join this up, there we go. And this is our otherwise, so when it's not valid, our unhappy path. And in here, the pattern for the removal headers is going to be all. Now the reason I'm putting this in because we don't want to pass the API key back to the user or any other headers that they're going to provide through. So we're going to remove all of the headers. We're then going to need to set some headers. Now these headers are going to need to be quite specific. What we need to do here is we need to go into the settings here. We need to set some special headers. So we've got the camel HTTP response code. Again, all these are simple. So for this, we said we want to return back 401. This is a bit of a special case, so it's not a custom header, it's a header associated with the HTTP response code that we're going to provide back to the user. On top of this as well, this API, although they're sending us the XML data, we're always going to be dealing with a content type of JSON. So we want content type, and then we want the setting for that to be application JSON. Brilliant. So we've removed the headers, we've set the headers. Now we need to set the body, the actual payload that we're going to send back. So let's do a search for body here. There we go, set body, and we can now drop that on the screen. Now in here, we're going to need to give some JSON back because we set the content type to JSON. So we're going to go error because it is an error. And then on here, what we want to be able to provide back is a message that gives them some context to that. So we're going to say API key is not valid. And there we go. So the unhappy path, we're now set and ready. For the happy path, what I think would be good to do, and we haven't done it yet, is we should probably log what that payload is. So if we hit and add log, we're going to add that to valid API key. That means what we're doing here is, quite simply, if it's not a valid API key, we're not even going to log the data. And the reason for that is, well, you haven't got past the wall yet. You haven't given us a valid API key. What we're giving you back is a response that says the data isn't valid because you haven't provided us with a valid API key header. So we're not worried about storing the data here. However, once we get past that, we would like to see what data they've sent us. So we're going to do that. We're then going to remove the headers. And we can then, from that point, because we can remove the API key, we don't need that, we validated it now. And we're then going to go on and further, let me put a star in there because it's all headers. We could then go further down and start building our API and the logic and the transformation that side. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to look to test this. So what we're going to then look to do is we're going to deploy this and then use Postman in order to test it. Now you'll notice it says draft here at the moment, so we can hit save. So we've fully saved that. And now what we've got on the right hand side is we've got the ability to deploy to test or production. Now we're just going to be working in test, so I'm going to hit deploy for that. We then need to give this some sort of version number, so we can call this version 1 first deploy. And then we can hit confirm. And straight away now that's running. If we hover over here, it tells us the version, and it's then created a new draft. So we can keep creating and editing and saving, and it will automatically start storing these versions and the version number that you've put against here. So it's really nice and easy for tracking as well. What we're then going to do now we've got a working API, we can now start testing this. So we can test this based on the fact the API key is not valid. And then we can also test it based on the fact that it is valid. And because we're not doing any manipulation at this point, when we get to here, what we've got is the original message less the headers. So we should just get the body of the Mapforce file back basically in that body. Okay, so let's look at doing that now. So if we open Postman, what we need to get is we need to get our flow endpoint for test. We can now go into Postman. It is a post. We can then paste that URL here. Now what I also need to do is I need to set the API key header. So API key, and then we need to set our header value. And then we need our body. So that will be our data for the Mapforce file. Let me just grab that from somewhere. There we go. Right, chuck that in here. So if we hit send, at the bottom here, we can see that we've got a 200 OK message, which is exactly what we expected, and we've got the payload that we expected as well. If we go to headers, we've not got the header that we've passed. We haven't got the API key header because that's been removed. Perfect. Now, let's test the API key. So if I put an X at the end of here, which should make it an invalid key, let's hit send and see what we get. We get a 401 unauthorized, and we're getting API key is not valid. So we've now got, very, very quickly, we've built an API, and an API that's able to respond to us based on a good and a bad result. Not bad, and that was incredibly quick to put together. However, now we need to start manipulating this data because we don't want to return XML for a start because we were going to be returning JSON. We need to be going through this process of transforming the data and then submitting it to our endpoints for Snapfulfil for both products and the alternate one as well. So let's start putting that together. In order to start putting together the endpoints for calling the product and the product alternate API, we need to start looking to transform our Mapforce data into something that we can then submit to these endpoints in Snapfulfil. So if I pull up on screen, we've got our Mapforce file here. And here we can see we've got our segments for the product. So what we're looking to do here is we want to create the product, and then we're going to pick up the EAN in order to create the alternate. There could be multiple alternates because there could be further data. Your data could be structured in a different way. And the way Snapfulfil works is we're going to create a product, and then you can create your alternate barcodes or identifiers based on that particular product. And there could be one or multiple of those. In this case, there's always going to be a one-to-one relationship between our SKU or our product and our EAN. So what we really want to do is we want to be able to create something that simulates a product set, and that product set will have a product and the alternate as part of that object. So what I've done is I've created a product sets XML. Zoom in just to make this clearer. And within product set or sets, we're going to have a product set, and a product set will contain a product, and the detail for this product are the attributes that relate directly to the API that we've got for Snapfulfil. Bring this over here. So if we go down onto product and we go to do a post, or look at the post endpoint, we can see we've got a SKU, we've got a biz ID. So if I now go back here, we've got a biz ID, and then we've got the SKU. So we've got all of that information there. Now we know we need to send this in JSON later, but we're just going to convert this to XML for the time being. So we are converting from the Mapforce file into a product set which contains a product and then potentially one or multiple product alternates. So we've got the product alternates and a product alternate child for each potential alternate SKU that we've got there. And again, this is just going to repeat for each product, or in this case, for each segment we've got in here. So how do we do that? Well, what we can do is we can use an application called Mapforce in order to do this. What we've been able to do is we've got the schema, which is related to our Mapforce file, and then we've mapped that to a product set, which is the data that we were just looking at in Notepad++ here. So we've dropped this data down, we've created a schema, and we've set the various elements. Now, this is a very simple mapping, but it can be more complex. And we're going to use this in order to create an XSLT file that we can import into a component within Dovetail. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about Mapforce, I've put a link at the top here, and that will take you to a separate video where I go into more detail on how to map within Mapforce and Altova's products. But for this particular solution within Dovetail, we're going to go over this very, very quickly because it's covered in a previous video. So here you can see we've got a straight connection here to create our product set. We're then picking the various elements that we require. So the description that's in English, we're just populating here because that's all we're interested in. We're then defaulting some of the weights and dimensions here. And then further down, we're then creating the product alternate, which is an EAN11 as the reference, and we're pulling the EAN11 into the alternate, and then we're also picking up the original SKU ID here, which will be the same value as the SKU ID that we're pushing into the product at the start here. So we can see that's the same reference down there. Now we've got this, we can then ensure that it's all correct, and we can basically export the XSLT file and import that into Dovetail. Okay, so now we've covered that, what we need to do is we need to go into components. We can then find our XSLT component. We can literally slot that in here. And then from within here, what we need to then do is we need to configure this and provide it with an XSLT file. Now we can upload the file, or we can provide it with a URL of the location of where that file is. In this case, we're just going to upload a file. So let's do that now and go through that process. So let's hit upload. We can then find our XSLT file, product sets here that we created, hit open, and there we go. And then we can hit compile. What compile does within this particular component is it just validates that the functions you've used within Altova Mapforce to create this XSLT file are all valid. So that's been accepted. That's perfect. We can close that. Now we've got that particular element there. So we know now on this side we're going to have all of our headers that we've potentially got, although we've removed headers, so there won't be any headers in this case, but we would in theory have those. Plus we're going to have the output, which will be a list of product sets. So we've got a product set, and then we've got the product set within it with the products and alternates. Now what we need to do is we need to start adding our calls to the endpoint API. So what we want to do here is we want to start splitting off. So what we want to do is we want to take this data. We want to go, well, for each product set, I want you to split off. And then for each product, I want you to create the product. And then I want you to go off and create the product alternates. So how would we do that? Well, I use the word split, and that is exactly what we need to do. So then we can drop the split component here. We can then configure this split component and decide what we want to do with it in order to pass our product sets through. So what we need to do in this instance is we need to create a type of XPath, because what we're going to use is XPath to describe the expression. So what we're saying here is we want to pass through a product set. Okay, so we can do that. We can hit validate. That's going to be fine. So now what that means is we're going to go down the bottom here and we're going to split by product set. Then what we would do at that point potentially is we'd then want to convert the data, or split the data, again. So we'll have another split, because now we've got a product set. Oh, if I can do that. Mouse is playing up. There we go. Then we want to split, and we want to create this based on the product. So again, going back to our Mapforce mapping here, we've got our product set. We then have our product. So we want to pass each of our products through. So again, showing that on here, so it's possibly a little bit clearer. So once we've got we want a product set through, we want to then pass the product. So if we go back to our map here, we can go product, perfect. From this split then, in theory, we want to then look at potentially passing that data through to the API endpoint. Now to do that, we would then want to do an API call, so a HTTP call here, where we would then call, not there, on the bottom here, because we're passing the product in. So product set, product, we would then want to call the API endpoint. However, we're still only looking at XML data at the moment. So we'd want to convert the XML to JSON. XML to JSON. So we can grab that in here, and then we could pass that data through to the API endpoint. Now there's some other things we're going to need for this particular endpoint. So if I just hit save here, we've got an error because we still need to complete this. We can then go to flows and we can start having a look at one of our API endpoints. Now, if we look at this, we can see that we need to provide an API key here. So what we need to be able to do is ensure that we pass the correct API key through. So we've got the API key that we need to pass through. Okay, that's fine. So we'll need to set a header in order to set that API key. So if we go back, as well as transforming it to JSON, we also want to set a header. So let's go set header. And then in here, we want to set a header of API key. And that was snap access 1, 2, 3. There we go. Then we want to configure our API endpoint. So what I need to do now is go back to the flow. This is going to be our products one. And I need to find out what that endpoint is. Now, obviously, with these are mocked endpoints. If this was the actual Snapfulfil endpoint, there would be a specific Snapfulfil API endpoint for that. That should be fine, I think. Right, let me go on here. So we can put this on here. This is going to be a post. And yep, that's fine there. Let's not worry about that for the moment. Perfect. What I want to do on here, let's go here. Let's create this with set headers. Instead of set header, actually, we'll keep it in line with the others, just in case we need to set some other headers later on. So this is going to be API key, and this was a simple expression, and this is snap access 1, 2, 3. There we go, fine. Okay, so this is then going to call our endpoint for the products. Now, every time we do a split here, a split has got some certain properties to it here. So when you say aggregation none, what you're saying basically is you're passing a message in, you're going to split on it. So in this case, we're going to pass the product set, then we're going to pass the product, and then we're going to do our API call. And it's going to complete all that. And when it's completed, it's going to come back up here, and we're going to carry on the right-hand side with the original message that came from this XSLT. If we wanted to pass anything back from what's happening below, we would then want to basically enable aggregation, and we'd tell it what type of data we would be aggregating as part of that. So that would be XML or JSON in this case. So for the purpose of what we're doing here, we would just set them to none. And this is basically splitting off almost like another thread, so to speak, although thread's probably the wrong word, but it's another route. So it's going off here, and it's going to go and then create our product. We could then, if we go log, let's add a log on the end here, for instance. And again, we've got our product bit. So if you turn aggregation on, so let's just do that quickly at the moment. This will then potentially become a problem, and it's saying error here because we need to carry on and set something further down here, because we're basically saying split off here and then proceed to carry on. If we don't do any of that, then we don't have an error in our route here, because there is no expectation to say that we're categorically passing something on through the split. So we've split here on our product. If we carry on here, we're still passing our product set through. So from here, in theory, we want to do the same thing. So I'm just going to copy this and connect this on here. So just to make this really, really clear, we're going to go product set, because that's what we're splitting on here. Then when we hover over it, becomes quite clear. Then we're going to go product on here, and actually I've incorrectly done that because we will need to further split. So let's just grab this down here, just copy this split just to save. I was dragging that from the palette, push this through on here, and this is going to be on the alternate. So what we want to do is link that up on here. And we can bring that down here. And let me just go back to make sure we go on here. We want to do it on products, then we want to do that on product alternate. So let's grab that. Go back on here, and we're splitting this on product alternate. Again, because we're splitting that, we've got the same problem as before, where we've got XML here. So we want to basically can turn that into JSON. We're going to set the same headers. We've got the same API key. However, the endpoint is different. So we need to go back on here, back here, go alternate API. We need to hit save where we were, and then we can come to here, and then we can copy our endpoint. And then we can change our endpoint here. So there we go. We're posting not to the products, but to the alternate. Perfect. That all finishes. And then what we need to be able to do, we're logging it here again, just so that it's visible within the log. Checking we've got our settings for the log done. Yes, we have. Perfect. And then from here, we can then do something like setting our headers, which we'll configure in a second. And then we can look at the body. And we can log at the end of there as well, just so that we're logging those ends. So within here, we can go through all of that, and we can look at setting the headers. So what we're going to do is a little bit here. We're going to grab, in fact, I could copy this one. Again, this is nice and useful. It saves us having to recode the same sort of elements. So here we're going to go, that's a 200, and we're returning JSON, which means in the body now, we need to supply it with something. So again, this is simple. We're going to go, actually, let's supply error, and let's say data processed successfully. We can then hit save, and now we've got our baseline flow set up. So here we're going to validate the API key. We're then going to split on product set. We're going to split on a product and call the product endpoint, the API. We're then going to pass that product set through because we've got aggregation turned to none, so it's off. And the alternate, we're then going to convert and pass that to the alternate endpoint. And then when that finishes, this returns back up with the original message coming through, and we're literally just going to set the headers. And in fact, we should remove any headers because we'll have the headers remained that we've potentially created further on. So in order to clean up this response and ensure we're not passing any created headers that we've used further down, we're going to remove all headers. We're then going to set headers for the response to say, yep, that's great, 200 okay, and it's JSON. We're then going to set the body for the response message, and then we're logging the result. In order to test this now, what we need to do is we need to save, and then we've got to deploy this interface or this flow. So we can call this version 2 with API calls. Hit confirm, and then we can look to actually test this. So let's do that now. We're going to open Postman again. We need to correct our API key. We've got our data in the body here, and then we can hit send. Okay, so here we've actually got an error. What we can now do is have a look in the log and see why this has happened. Let's go into Flow Manager. We can find our product flow. We can then go on to transactions, and we can see the transaction we just submitted. So going through this, we know based on, if I open this up in another tab, we can have here, we know we're looking at the product split, and then we want to have a look at what we've got passed through to the second split here, just to see what's going on. So we go through, we've got our first split. So if we go to the second one, we know that it's receiving the product set. And then when we're converting it to JSON, the body is blank. So we're telling it to split based on product, but it's not doing anything. So let's go into our split here. So the first split, we're splitting on product set, and we've got XPath. Second split, we're splitting on product. Okay, I've made a mistake here. So this is an XPath expression here, so we need to tell it that it is. And I'll probably need to do the same on the next one as well. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Very simple issue there, but we can see based on the result here that when we get to converting it to JSON, the input to this, the body was literally the string of product, because we hadn't told it that the expression here was actually an XPath, not a literal. So now we've corrected that. We can then hit save, and then we can look to do another release. I just want to make sure that everything else there looks okay. I think so. Right, let's give it a try. So version 3, corrected XPath split. Hit confirm, and we can see there that it starts running straight away, and we can now do another resubmission. There we go. So it says error data processed successfully, but we've got 200 OK. I believe this is probably just a mistake on here. Yeah, it shouldn't be error, it should be success. So 200 OK, so we know we've been successful on there. So again, I'll save this and we'll do a very quick deployment on here. Version 4. Corrected body. We've got that deployed. And just to show you the way this versioning works, I can jump back to the one that we created first of all here, and we can very quickly see, and we can actually hit start flow here if we wanted to then deploy that older version. We're still on draft. Oh no, we've still got so the current one is corrected body. So let's go back to that. There we go. Bring this back up, do a submission, and there we go. We've got it correct there. So that's all working, but we saw earlier when we had a problem, we exposed the error on here, so we can pass back that error to the calling user. In this case, it's Postman. What I want to do is, if we go back here to one of these APIs, so we've got the product API here. What I'm going to do is I've got a version here that I can look to deploy, where no matter what we do, we are setting it to a 400 and a bad request. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to release a version of the products API, which is always going to give us an invalid response or a 400 back. Now, when I post this, it's just giving us the success. So it's saying it successfully received that request, which it has, but in this case, it wouldn't have actually created if I go back to the product flow, it wouldn't have successfully created our product on this first call. And in fact, if it didn't create the product, then in theory, it wouldn't have been able to create the alternate related to that product, because the product there would not have existed. So we've very quickly been able to build an API that will create a product, create the alternate, and give us a kind of confirmation back that it's received that request. So as this stands at the moment, what we'd ideally want to do is we want to go to our HTTP requests here, and we want to use the error route. And what that means is if we don't get a 200 here, then it's going to drop out to our error route here. So let's do that just to clear this up for the moment. And then I can show you what that would do. So our error route, we can look at adding, for instance, here as a minimum, we probably want to add a log, but we might want to do something else within this error route. Now, you can think of the error route as a sort of debug route. So there's no possibility of passing back to the user at this point here. It's more a dropout with regards to login and any actions you might want to do as part of that. So you could do things like insert into a database, and you can do all that sort of capturing that part there. But it's here where you would want to try and build up your sort of happy and unhappy paths and basically receive the response from here and do some validation and maybe some content routing based on that. So now I've turned this on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save that and deploy this. So we've got version 5, I think it is. Let's do that with error route. And now if I try and resubmit this with the product flow that we know isn't working, here we get a 500 like we did before when we had an issue with the data, but this is being generated because we're basically hitting this point here and it's dropping out to the error route. If we now go into our flow manager, we find our product flow and we go to transactions, we can actually see where our errors hit. So within this particular transaction, we got the error after the HTTP component for both of the products here. So that's both errored out. So what we can do now is we can go into logs, and it's actually here where we can see the actual error. So as we are aware, it's tried calling the products API and it's got a 400 error. So we can use the flow designer in order to locate the errors and look at the logs in order to decide what we need to do to resolve those. So at least this way, if we've got a product that's coming through that fails, it's not going to try and carry on and do the alternate. It's going to drop off and give us the error route and stop at that point. But what we really want to do is we want to later try and build on this solution in order to direct it using content routing and some other components within Dovetail itself in order to route this so that what we can do is we can say if there's bad product, we can return it back to the user. We can set the header to 400 and we can give them the products that failed. And equally, if it's been able to create the product but not the alternates, we can do the same thing there. So we'll look at doing that in a later episode. I'll do like a part 2 where we look at building on what we've got here for the product flow, but extending it in order to fully capture the different routes that can happen with regards to what we get back from the Snapfulfil APIs and how we would look to handle that in order to provide it back to the user. For now, let's go back and review what we've learned so far and review Dovetail as a platform. So we've now built our API. We receive an API call from SAP, which is the Mapforce file, and then we're creating our products and the alternate that goes with it. Let's now look at the pros and the cons of Dovetail. So on the pros, it's a very clean UI. It's easy to use, and it's very much a drag and drop workflow. It's very quick to prototype. So in the short period now, we've just built an API. So we can receive an API call, and then we can basically call another system, in this case, Snapfulfil, in order to create products and alternates. It's really simple and easy to use from a versioning perspective. We saw earlier where we can jump between different versions and we can deploy and undeploy different versions. And again, it's leveraging tools like Mapforce, where there are already standards there, and these tools are already sort of industry standard tools. And the same when it comes to any scripting, that can be done in Groovy, which again is a standardized scripting language. Great product vision for enhancements. So with Dovetail, they are constantly adding more and more features, more and more components. However, they've already got pre-built components for pretty much everything you'll need to connect to. Now, let's look at the cons. So it's not as established as something like Boomi, where Boomi's been around for quite a period of time, and so have other iPaaS platforms. But on the flip side, their cost position is significantly less. So Boomi and some of the other competitors are quite expensive, whereas Dovetail's proposition is significantly less. And once you've bought into the platform, you can build as many interfaces and have as many transactions as you wish. And the last one from a cons perspective is the lack of dashboard. So it doesn't have a really nice dashboard like some of the other platforms might have. However, I've already spoken to Dovetail and it is in the works and should hopefully be released fairly soon. Well, that's my introduction and demo to Dovetail. I'll be looking further at Dovetail in order to release some further content. And if you've got any questions about Dovetail, or you would like to have a go with Dovetail and see how you can get on with the platform, please reach out.